We are very happy to be hosting this event. Boy, I really just have to, above all, express my gratitude for your being here, especially those of you who've come from campuses beyond Westmont. This is the 21st time that we have held the conversation on the liberal arts here at Westmont College. You might think that after 20 times, it would somehow get old hat, but it is fresh every time. And it's fresh every time because of the new folks we get to meet. We get to learn from those who are beyond our walls here at Westmont College. The last time we were able to do this together was in 2020. So it's been a bad drought for a couple of years, and we are very, very grateful that those of you from other campuses have joined us today. You enrich us tremendously. We have a lot of different places here represented, and that's always been a part of the DNA of the conversation on the liberal arts. Can we bring together people from different backgrounds with different perspectives and different experiences to learn from one another about our shared concerns for effective liberal arts education? That's really what the program has been about from the beginning. And you all are making it happen today. So very grateful for your presence here. We've got a lot of different kinds of institutions represented in the room today. Obviously, we've got small private liberal arts colleges like Westmont, all the way to very large R1 research universities. We've got faith-based colleges. Westmont is an example of that. From a broad range of religious backgrounds, as well as colleges and universities with no religious identity. And then, of course, we've got a variety of academic disciplines represented in the room and places within the institutions that you're a part of. So that variety, I think, enriches our conversations enormously, and it's a part of what we enjoy so much. I'm especially grateful to the students who might be with us at this session and maybe throughout the conference. They are a terrific contribution. The driving question of our time together over the next several days will be basically, what kind of education do young people need now to equip themselves for a world that's going to change dramatically through their adult lives? Changes really that are already underway, changes that are a result of climate change but have to do with a lot more than climate, all of the social, political, economic, demographic changes that are out in front of us. What kinds of skills, what knowledge, what forms of learning, what understanding of the purpose and nature of learning do students of today need to be well equipped for the world of tomorrow? Those questions are fundamentally about students' educational needs. So why not have some students here to weigh in on those questions? No good for those of us who are further down the road to be talking about that with ourselves. Let's get some students in on the conversation. So we're very grateful to have students here with us and through the next couple of days. Speaking of gratitude, I'd like to highlight those who are really responsible for what's coming your way in the next couple of days. This annual conference always is driven by faculty interest and initiative, and this year is no exception. This conference all started on a beach walk with my colleague, historian Marianne Robbins, who is right up here in the front of the room. Soon, our colleague Jeff Schloss and Lisa DeBoer, Jeff from biology, Lisa from art history, came alongside and helped craft some of the fundamental questions of the conference and explore who might be good contributors. So I am very grateful to the three of you for all of the contributions you've made. Aaron Sizer's name will be familiar to you. From correspondence over the last several months. Aaron is the Director of Congregational and Academic Integration at the Gady Institute, and he really has been the driving organizational force behind the conference right from its first conception right to today. So I was out of the country for like 5 months and had essentially nothing to do with this. So we really have Aaron to thank for all of the great work. Thank you very much, Aaron. Also key to making this event happen has been the tireless work of the others from the Gady Institute. I don't know if Kristen Full is here. She is the Director of Student Engagement, Strategic Partnerships, and Operations at the Gady Institute. She is so good at operations that she might actually be picking somebody up from the airport right now. But you'll get to know Kristen over the next couple of days. Our Assistant Director, Sarah Garland, she might have been out at the registration table. You might have met Sarah out there. And our Program Coordinator, Grace Condello, who's in the back of the room. Wave a little bit, Grace, for everybody. Thank you all for all of the huge work you've done. Grace and Aaron and Sarah and Kristen all will be really good resources for you over the course of the next couple of days. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to chase us down and ask us. Okay. Let me take a moment to give you a sense of the sessions that are coming in the next couple of days. Not their content so much, but their format, because it's a little different than what you might be accustomed to in a typical academic conference. So we'll have 3 keynote addresses like this afternoon, today and tomorrow afternoon, and then again Saturday morning. In each of those cases, the speaker will get to hear from for roughly 45 minutes or so. And then here's where we diverge from the standard format. We'll take a little break. You can refresh your coffee or your water, take a bathroom break. There's snacks will still be out. We'll take a brief break because we're coming back for an extended time of conversation. And that conversation is going to start with you all around your tables. Our speaker will finish their time with some prompts for that table conversation. And then when we come back from our break, you'll have an opportunity to get to know the others at your table and to chat with them a little bit about what you've heard in the talk and how you might be responding to it. And then we'll come together for a conversation among the whole group. I'll be seated up here today with our speaker. I might have a couple of thoughts, but we're going to be eager to hear from the floor as quickly as we can. So that'll continue for maybe a half an hour or so. So look for that time of extended conversation. We really do take the name of this conference seriously, the Conversation on Liberal Arts. We want to make it as conversational as possible. The other sessions of the conference, the concurrent sessions, are also a little weird. You might be accustomed to academic conferences where you go and just listen to people read their papers out. We're not doing that here. We are going to come into those concurrent sessions in the hope that you have chosen that concurrent session because you've done a little bit of homework. You've had a look already at the papers being offered there. The presenters, if that's even the right word for them, aren't so much presenters as they are sort of discussion catalysts. So they're going to have maybe 10 or 15 minutes total between all of them to sort of get some ideas on the table, get some questions for discussion out on the table, and then we're going to turn to the small groups that will be gathered in those concurrent sessions for conversation about the ideas and issues that arose in the papers for that session. So be ready to be full-blown participants in that, and if you get the chance, do that homework of having a look at the papers and the materials that have been offered ahead of time so that we can launch right into discussion. And I say all this in case you've ever wondered what it sounds like to your students when you try to get them to do their reading. You are now those people. Okay, I said a moment ago that the driving question of our time together is, what is the education young people need now in order to navigate well a world that will undergo enormous changes in their adult lives? Changes that are already underway in a warming world and a changing climate. And I gestured to a couple of dimensions to that question. What will students need to know? What skills might they most need? What sensibilities or character traits might they most want to cultivate? But perhaps the most fundamental question to all of these is, what understanding of the purpose and nature of education should we be inviting young people into? If we persist in thinking that higher education is about short-term return on investment, where return there is understood in financial terms alone, can we hope to succeed in helping prepare students for a future very different from the present? Perhaps as much as anything, our task is to transform students' vision of what college can be for them and of what kind of learning experience will meet their deepest long-term needs. Those fundamental questions, to what end are we doing this and how should we do it to best work toward those ends, I think those questions will come up again and again. In fact, I think they're going to come up in about 5 minutes as soon as I get out of the way finally. So let me just say a couple of words about our first speaker, and then I will indeed get out of the way. Athena Aktipis comes to us from Arizona State University, where she's a member of the psychology department. She earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from Reed College, which I'm sure many of you know is an excellent liberal arts college up in Portland. From there, she went on to a master's and a PhD in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. It's important that you not let this apparent disciplinary specialization mislead you. The real heart of Athena's research and writing is cooperation science, which is a highly interdisciplinary field that studies cooperation at all levels, from the social to the cellular. Athena's publication record is amazing for the range of kinds of areas that she's exploring. Just consider some of the projects that Athena leads. She directs the Cooperation and Conflict Lab. She co-directs the Human Generosity Project. She directs the Human and Social Evolution Project at the Center for Evolution and Cancer. She hosts the Zombified podcast and founded Zombified Media. That's going to be one worth asking about. And she launched the Cooperation in the Apocalypse Project to better understand how crises affect cooperation. And I have it on good authority that she did all of these things in the last 6 months. I'm kidding about that, of course, but really, who can do all this? It's amazing. Recently, Athena's been working on how principles from cooperation science might be applicable to higher education institutions. That's where we come in, I think. And so I expect that we will be getting some of those ideas this afternoon. I think we have a lot to look forward to in the next few minutes. Cooperation, zombies maybe, the apocalypse for sure. What could be better on a beautiful Thursday afternoon? Please join me in welcoming Athena Aktipis.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. You got me with a lot to live up to up here right now. So, but I will be talking about the apocalypse. And but before I do that, I have to say how impressed I am with this whole meeting, how interdisciplinary it is, how the very beginning of this meeting came from that interdisciplinary energy and discussion. So it is a true honor and delight to be here. So thank you, Chris. Thank you to the organizing committee. Thank you for having me here. As Chris mentioned, it is a beautiful Thursday. So I feel like, why are we talking about the apocalypse when it's beautiful out? But if you were here yesterday, you know, there was hail, sleet. It was a little something like this. I don't know. That's kind of how it felt to me. I was like, what is falling out of the sky? It doesn't seem like it's the time of year when I should expect that. But as we know, life is kind of getting more uncertain, more apocalyptic, you could say. Climate is getting more variable. The frequency of weird weather and the severity of it is increasing. And we have all just been through over the last few years what I think a lot of us would genuinely call an apocalypse of sorts, the COVID with all of the changes that that has wrought. And it actually gives us an opportunity to think, well, what do we mean when we say apocalypse? So, if we're going to be talking about education in the apocalypse, well, we should at least, define our terms. And if you were there earlier today for the faculty discussion, you'll know that Jeff and I talked a little bit about how the original meaning of apocalypse is not the end of the world. So, contrary to popular belief, the apocalypse doesn't have to be the end of the world. It can be a revelation of the reality of risk that we face. And so when negative events happen, when we encounter challenges, when we notice that they're increasing in severity and frequency, that's really important information for us in rethinking how we are approaching things. So as we think about education in the apocalypse, I want you to be thinking about the apocalypse in those terms, not as something that's catastrophic, but as events that force us to reckon with our assumptions about how stable the world is, about how expected the events are that might happen in the coming years or decades. I'm going to introduce myself and my work a little bit so you guys know where I'm coming from when I share with you some of my thoughts and insights about how we can use cooperation science in education. So I study cooperation across systems, as Chris mentioned. So I work on what are the sort of shared general principles that apply when we're looking at cellular societies or human societies, animal societies. What are the challenges of cooperation, and how do large-scale organizations, multicellular bodies, animal societies overcome those challenges? So one of the things that's really important to realize is that we as humans come together and do things together, and any system, individuals come together to do things because there are benefits that can come from that. You can create public goods that everybody benefits from. You can achieve what economists call economies of scale, where you're basically able to do things more efficiently when you have more individuals. You have division of labor, where you can accomplish things you could never do as one individual because you have different people who can do different jobs, can bring different skills and expertise. And this is what happens in human societies, but it's also what happens, within our bodies. Every one of our cell types is an example of how division of labor can make for a really complex and amazing whole. And if you've never stopped to think about it, we are made of 30 trillion cells. So that's orders of magnitude more than the number of humans on Earth. And yet, every millisecond, we're cooperating and coordinating among all of our cells to make it possible for us to be functional at the level of our beings, right? That is just mind-blowing if you really stop to think about it. So we have a lot to learn from looking at our bodies as multicellular cooperation systems. We also have a lot to learn from looking at a variety of other systems. So now, in my educational pathway, I've had the opportunity to be in a lot of different places where interdisciplinarity was part of my education. So at Reed College, even though I was in psychology, I took a lot of classes that were in evolutionary biology and computer science, philosophy, political science. And then when I was at UPenn, I took anthropology classes along with my psychology classes and demography classes. When I went to the University of Arizona for my postdoc, I went deep into ecology and evolutionary biology and computational modeling. So I use methods from across many different disciplines and frameworks from across a lot of different disciplines. And over the years, my goals have really grown from, initially I was really focused on sort of understanding these principles of cooperation across systems. That's still very important to me. But now I see that there are a lot of places where we can apply these principles to helping us as individuals and societies to be more resilient. And one of the places where I am doing that is in the very institution that I inhabit at ASU. So in terms of both the courses that I teach and the programs that I've been building at ASU, trying to imbue the principles of cooperation science in those structures. So some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about over the course of the next 40 minutes or so will be things that I've already implemented, and some of them are principles that I'm working with ASU's administration to see if we can add into the institutional structures at ASU to facilitate greater capacities for cooperation and resilience. So to give you a little sampling of how cooperation can apply across systems, can look at multicellular cooperation, look at multi-species microbial systems, look at human societies. So in my work, I've looked at cancer actually as a breakdown of multicellular cooperation. So cancer essentially as cellular cheating, because what happens is that cancer cells stop following the rules that multicellular cells follow in order to make the body viable. So in a normal body, cells are inhibiting their proliferation. They're going through controlled cell death if they're threatening to the body. There are all sorts of mechanisms for allocating resources effectively within the body. There's also division of labor and maintenance and investment in the extracellular environment. There's lots of stuff in between our cells that helps make our body work, and that needs to be, those things need to be produced and need to be cleaned up. So there's basically, you know, a whole ecology in the body that our cells help to maintain. And cancer breaks down all of those. And the reason that cancer is a problem is because not only does cancer sort of stop supporting the natural cooperation of our bodies, but also it can re-evolve some of these cooperative capacities for the benefit really of the cancer. So applying cooperation theory to cancer has led to a lot of insights, and I've been working with cancer biologists for about a decade on questions around, you know, applying cooperation theory to cancer, and this is my first book, The Cheating Cell, which is about applying cooperation theory and evolutionary biology to cancer. I also work on kombucha. So those of you who enjoy the effervescent taste of the fermented tea kombucha, you might not know that it's actually a cooperative system made up of yeast and bacteria, many different species that cooperate in order to produce that delicious beverage that we drink. And we have in my lab studied this cooperative process, and we've also looked at, well, what happens when you challenge kombucha with swabs that we've collected at citizen science events. So you put these hand swabs inside and you see, does it get contaminated or not? And it turns out that if you put these hand swabs in regular tea, it gets gross and contaminated and we have to throw it away pretty fast. If you put it in kombucha, not only does the kombucha keep out the invaders, but you actually get a very robust cooperation response of the yeast and bacteria, where they create a thick biofilm that we think is essentially a collective immune system response of the bacteria and yeast. So this is something that we are working on in my lab right now to sort of disentangle exactly what's going on with those cooperative partners. And then I've worked in human societies on cooperation in times of need, and in particular on this idea of need-based transfers, where what we've seen is that people will help each other without expecting to get paid back when they encounter unexpected negative events and challenges. So I'm just going to show you, we have field sites around the world where we have sort of looked at these sharing systems that people deploy when they have challenges. And we found really that across all of these societies, people help each other in times of need. We've also done computer modeling. I've done the computer modeling looking at the viability of these strategies, and we have experiments that we've done in the lab as well. So through this multi-method, multidisciplinary project, we have been able to look at these questions of need-based transfers and see, we've seen that this is a natural response that humans have. When there's a disaster, when there's an apocalypse, whether large or small, people help each other. And I know there are a lot of words up here, and some of them are small, so I apologize for that. But the big picture here is that across all of these societies, across all these different subsistence systems, across many different kinds of risks and hazards, you see that people manage risk by working together with others. And many times that's through helping in times of need, where individuals will ask for help if they're in need, and then if you're asked and able, you help. But it can also be with preparing ahead of time for those disasters. So this is a very, very natural thing for us humans. We see it, across all the societies that we've looked at, that people cooperate in order to deal with risks. So then we can ask, well, how can we take some of these things that we have learned and use those to help enhance our individual resilience, our societal resilience? Can we cultivate more need-based transfers in human relationships? I have a graduate student, former graduate student, she's actually now a professor at Boise, who looked at friendship. And she asked people what were the most important things in a friendship. And one of the top things was, helps me when I'm in need. And you know what one of the least important things was? Pays me back. So I think, when it comes to the people who we're closest to, we're already thinking in these need-based transfer terms, even if we're not being explicit about it. I think it's also important to figure out how we can encourage risk management and collective risk management in communities, whether those are neighborhoods or institutions of higher education and research. How can we be proactive about having risk management not just be something that somebody in some office is responsible for, but something that we all are responsible for, and that we actually enjoy building a community around how do we manage risk together. And there's also an opportunity to offer alternatives to standard market-based insurance here. And standard market-based insurance, not only are there more challenges now because insurance companies aren't as willing to insure certain kinds of things that they were before, right? Because they realize the frequency and intensity of some of these disasters is increasing, and they might not be able to actually afford to pay. So as there are those kinds of challenges to market-based insurance, and also as people experience more needs for insurance but an inability to pay for insurance, we need alternatives, right? And these need-based transfer systems are an ancient and widespread solution that humans have used for managing risk, and are therefore things that we should look to as we're trying to manage the changing face of risk, right, that we are seeing now. And I don't have to tell you that our problems are becoming much more entangled, right? We have these wicked problems where one problem begets another, and that makes it also hard to sort of figure out, where do we even start? How do we assess what the risks are that we face? How do we insure against them? And the nice thing about need-based transfer systems is that they're very general. You don't have to specify every kind of help that would occur. They're based on relationships that people have with each other, where they don't want to see the other person suffer, right? So they help if they can, and if they're asked to help. There's also, the issue of tech and AI that are really changing the landscape of our human existence. I don't know, how many of you guys have tried ChatGPT? Yeah, pretty much everyone, right? So what does that mean for our future? The fact that so many of our interactions are already mediated by technology, and that technology can jump in and actually produce a lot of the kinds of things that we might be asking students to produce, right? How do you incorporate that into the future of education? And on this point, I would take a slight detour just to talk about the fact that as we are sort of putting together plans for our classes, we should think not just about how to handle sort of risk and the apocalypse, but how to empower students so that they want to bring their whole brains to the classroom, right? Because if we're just setting up situations where we're kind of asking the students to be zombies, right, then they will come with that sort of attitude as well. And so how do we create spaces that are fun and engaging, that will invite students to bring their whole selves to the classroom? I will point out also, it can be challenging to face the sort of reality of how much is changing in the world, in education, but also in general. And so facing that denial and kind of grappling with the fact that there's actually a lot of opportunities that we can achieve from facing the apocalyptic situations that, you know, are becoming increasingly common. So we have the tools actually in our brains and in our collective capacities, because as humans we have faced apocalyptic conditions since the dawn of humanity. If you look at the kinds of demographic patterns that you see in small-scale societies, and you project that onto mathematical models, it becomes clear that we, as humans, over the course of our evolutionary history, have had a pretty high likelihood of losing a substantial portion of our population just over the course of our lifetime. So over the course of a typical human's lifetime, you probably lose somewhere around 20% of the population of your group, which is a lot more than anything that we have experienced in recent history. But this is something that humans have been dealing with for a long time. And so built in to our very DNA is the ability to deal with catastrophes and to work together to deal with them more effectively than we could as individuals. Because we as humans were not able to survive on our own, you know? Despite, you know, some of the television shows out there that suggest that maybe you can make it out there on your own. If you really watch those, you see it's really, really hard, and they don't last that long, right? They eventually have to come back to human society. We can't survive on our own. So how can we deal with the challenges that we're facing? So managing risk is one of those really important foundations. And if we look at the strategies that can be used, and these are strategies that we see in human societies, these are also ways that people who study risk management and insurance kind of break down the ways that you can manage risk. So we'll take a second to go through them. So we'll start with risk retention. And here we've got a prepper in the basement, right? Setting up all the water bottles and the canned food. Risk retention is essentially when you have the capacity, you have enough resources to insure yourself. You can do that on your own. You can also do that in a community. But risk retention assumes that you have enough resources to manage risk on your own. Then there's risk avoidance, which, you know, my illustrator has sort of humorously put as this person, you know, under the covers, like, you know, pretending that there isn't actually a problem. But risk avoidance can actually be a good strategy, which is don't do things that are actually, you know, more risky. Do things that are less risky. So that's one approach. But of course, if you avoid all risk, then you may also be giving up opportunities, right? So risk avoidance isn't always the best strategy. You can do risk reduction, which is anything that reduces the likelihood or severity of a potential disaster. So here we've got somebody, you know, fixing the roof. That's an example of risk reduction. And then we have my favorite, risk transfer, which is a sort of broad umbrella term that applies to need-based transfers, which I've been talking to you quite a bit about because they're close to my heart. And with risk transfer, you basically agree to share some portion of your risk with others. They can be others in your community, or in the case of insurance, insurance is actually a sort of market-based risk transfer scheme where you're paying an insurance company to take some portion of your risk. So that's risk transfer, but less heartwarming than, you know, people helping each other out. And so if we sort of look at this in the broader context of human existence, we have to acknowledge that cooperation is really essential to most of these forms of risk management. You can do them a lot better in community than you can as individuals. And you can't transfer risk without having someone to transfer with, right? So it's essential for risk transfer. And because of the fact that as humans we have faced challenges since the dawn of existence, some of them really dramatic, that means that our feelings of well-being, even when things seem okay, right, those should be tied into how good our risk management network is. Because if we don't have a good risk management network, then we are vulnerable when things start to change. And so I think that when we're thinking about, you know, our communities that we live in, our neighborhoods, or where we work, or where we go to school, that thinking about, like, how do we create environments where people feel really supported and feel like, yes, I have relationships with others where I know that they would be there for me if something happened because they have a stake in my own well-being. I think that's essential. So let's talk about learning in the apocalypse. I know, you know, for me as a professor, when COVID hit, I felt a little bit like this. It was like, oh, I'm, you know, on my computer trying to teach, and I don't know what's going on outside. It's crazy. And I think, you know, a lot of us sort of had this response of like, okay, at least this is fine here, you know, even though outside it's crazy. But, you know, there's also a sense in which kind of avoiding that reality of what's going on outside, it's only helpful to a certain point, right? And then you have to engage with, okay, well, what does this mean for how we can do things differently? How can we reshape what we're doing so that we're more resilient as we go forward? And so I'm going to offer some ways that we can, as a community, potentially reshape some of the institutions of higher learning that we're in. And some of this is based on programs that we've been implementing at ASU, and then some of this is a little more aspirational. I'm going to talk to you guys about the first two things really today, but happy to discuss more about the bottom two when we have time to chat sort of, you know, outside of this presentation. But I've been developing games for 2 decades or so, both computer-based games that are agent-based models that students can play with, and then games that students play in the classroom to teach complex concepts and to engage them in ways that allow them to start building relationships where they trust each other and can work together effectively. Then my team and I at ASU, we've been working on developing the set of cooperation design principles that we think can be applied in university settings because they're effective in other settings, and we've begun implementing some of those. We also have a set of mentoring programs that I'm running with my colleague, Christina Bacciu, where we provide students with sort of social and intellectual and professional development environment all in one in order to create that sense of security and embeddedness that we feel is very, very important for giving students the space to be able to really reach their full potential in terms of their intellectual engagement. And we have many arts projects as well, which I would love to talk to you about, but I'm gonna sort of keep things focused on the first two in the interest of time. Okay, so how can we bring a little bit of fun in and at the same time teach things that are complicated? Well, I have a few examples of games that I've developed that have been really fun and have given my students a chance to deeply understand in like an embodied way some principles that are challenging. So one of them is based on, actually this is based on my dissertation research on what I call the walk-away strategy, which is basically you always cooperate and then you leave if your partner or your group is not cooperative with you. Very, very simple, doesn't require any retaliation, and it allows cooperation to evolve and be stable in computational models. And so I created a game where students would play as agents like in the computational model, and then they could see, you know, well, what actually happens? I'm going to show you guys a little video. I'm going to tell you what's going on in it first. But basically, the students are playing a prisoner's dilemma game. How many of you guys know what a prisoner's dilemma game is? So, yeah, okay, so it's basically like if you both cooperate, you both get a good outcome. If you both defect, you both get a bad outcome. And if I cooperate and you defect, then I get the sucker's payoff, which is even worse than if we both defected, and you as a defector would get a really good payoff. So there's an incentive to cooperate, or there's an incentive to defect the individual level, but cooperate at the group level. And so students in this video, you'll see they have a little piece of paper where they're keeping track of their score, and they have a pen. And if they hold up the blunt end of the pen, that's cooperating. If they hold up the pointy end, that's defecting. Okay, so very simple, doesn't require any special materials, and I actually have all of the materials here. This is on my blog, so you can download all of these things, including if you want to use game cards, you can, score sheets, etc. But here, I'll show you what it looks like when the students are playing. So in the model, I have agents that move around. They interact with each other, just like you see these students interacting. And they're keeping the score, so then they can see at the end how different strategies did. And I'll give them different prompts. So first I'll say, okay, if your birthday is between January and June, you're a cooperator. If it's between July and December, you're a defector. And then I have them play. And then they can see, oh, okay, this is how the strategies do, if you don't have a choice. And then I start letting them have a little bit more autonomy. I let them decide if they want to stay or leave. And then they can see for themselves that if you allow individuals to stay and keep interacting when they have a good rapport, when they're both cooperating, then that is sufficient to make defection a strategy that doesn't work. And it's very simple. You don't even need to regulate the number of interactions that people are having. It works anyway because there's enough variation in how often people are playing, but the overall pattern still works. So I'll have the students put their payoffs up on the board, and then we can look at the how the different strategies do. And I found that the retention and the engagement that students have, if they're playing a game like this, so much better than if I just, went up and gave a lecture about the walkaway strategy. So that is one of the games. And then there's a game that has a number of different names. Now I'm calling it Cheater Cell. It's based on cancer, really, and where you play as a cell in the multicellular body that could either be a cancer cell or could be a cell that decides, since you're the cell, to try to keep cooperative conditions in the body. And essentially, in this game, it begins with a setup where everybody has you have a few people in the front. They all have pieces of construction paper. They have piles of colored construction paper. And they play as sort of different teams or different cancer clones. And then there's a set of rules, very simple rules, that are based on the regulatory systems in cells in the body, that in order to divide, you need to have permission from two neighbors. In order to move, you need to have permission from two neighbors. And at any time, you can kill your neighbor for any or no reason. And that's pretty much how it works in the body with cells. And so you allow students to play this game, and there's 2 winning conditions. One is that you get to the back of the room with your clone, right? So you get through all the seats and you get to the back of the room, and then that's successfully metastasizing, which not good for the body, good for the cancer clone, at least in the short term. And then the other winning condition is that all of these, 6 or 8 different cancer clones cooperate to create a 2-layer tissue that maintains itself. Okay, so there's like a cooperative win, and then there's a competitive win. And I have never seen any groups decide to play for a cooperative win. Everybody's always just trying to get to the back, unfortunately. But it's still it gives students a chance to see how these dynamics play out. And on my blog here, I have you can sort of see. These are different ways of envisioning what's going on over time. You can see the clones' sizes grow. You can see the depth of invasion. This is just looking at how far in the auditorium the different colors made it to. And you can download the data spreadsheet so you could collect the data easily and make these graphs as the game goes on. And I'll show you, this is a video from actually playing this at a summer school that was mostly for faculty and advanced postdocs studying evolutionary medicine. And at the very end, you'll hear a chant of blood, blood, blood from a very well-regarded evolutionary medicine researcher who got very into the game. So here you can see it's very dynamic. Everybody's asking, can I do this? Can I do that? They're jumping, to try to get to the different rows, to get to the back. And everybody's really engaged, Nobody is sitting there in the back not doing anything. So this is Steve Stearns. So.
Once you reach the final row, you can go out the door.
We're in the bloodstream.
All right.
One.
Yeah, so everybody has fun with this one, and taking that perspective of a cancer cell by embodying the cancer cell really gives an opportunity to look at cancer differently and realize those evolutionary dynamics, they apply within the body to cells that are evolving to do things really that they shouldn't do that can be damaging to the body. So that's cheater cell. And then this final one, I'm sorry, I don't have a video for this one. I wish I did. But this one has the best name, Bunny Dynasty. So in this game, students play as bunny ancestors who are trying to make as many bunnies as possible and basically control the behavior of their bunnies to try to maximize their evolutionary fitness. So it's kind of a zombie game. I could call it zombie bunnies, actually, because they're, the students are actually having control over all these bunnies. So this is what Bunny Dynasty looks like, though. I have some pictures. So students basically will make bunnies on note cards. They'll draw them, and then they'll give their birthday, and then these bunnies can beget more bunnies and take care of those bunnies, and they have to basically make sure that the bunnies that are taking care of other bunnies are old enough to do that, otherwise they can get eaten by roving wolves. And I have a few students be roving wolves that are like going around trying to like get these note card bunnies. And essentially over the course of one class, you have a whole society of bunnies emerge, and you have sort of different factions, different groups with different cultures emerging, and the students get really, really into it. And at the end, I have them sort of calculate their inclusive fitness, so how well they did in evolutionary terms of like making lots and lots of bunnies, and talk a little bit about how to accomplish those goals, and give advice to the next students who will play this game. And I find that these advice things are the most fun of all of this. So depending if you're playing as a male or female, there's different opportunities and different challenges, and it's really interesting to see their reflections on this. You find actually that despite, you know, what you might think initially, a lot of the focus ends up being on sort of creating these cooperative structures where everyone is taking care of everybody's bunnies. And I find that's great. And then also, I love this, you know, focus on grandchildren, say no to war. Like, yeah, great, awesome. So, you know, these are just ways of getting students to, you know, think about these evolutionary challenges of, you know, how have our ancestors evolved, what have they evolved to do, with something that's very interactive, that involves lots of movement, engagement, and gives them opportunities to think, you know, strategically about, okay, well, what would make sense from an evolutionary perspective? Oh, like, what are the cultural considerations that come into play as well? Because I actually, you know, in this bunny dynasty game, there are various ways that I allow culture to come in with how they name their bunnies, and how they actually, when they greet each other, they have to say something and do some sort of hand signal or movement that is their culture. So there are these different elements that allow for this emergent complexity and for students to get really, really into it. So, all right, so let's move on from these games and talk about some bigger picture principles. So I have 6 of them for you guys, cooperation design principles that we can potentially use, some of which we're already using at ASU, to try to make the space of education more cooperative, more resilient. First one, you probably could have guessed I was going to put this one up here, is need-based transfers. So how can we structure things at the university so that people share resources and information in a need-based way? So if we have a culture where people realize that they have many of the same goals and want to work together to achieve those goals, then it's much easier to be in a space where we can all be intellectually generous and we can share resources in order to accomplish goals that we have. And, you know, if I don't have enough resources this month to accomplish my goals and someone else has extra, how do we actually create those structures that allow for those transfers to happen? And how do we allow for those transfers of information to happen? How do we build those networks that really facilitate the need-based transfer of information? You know, me being able to ask somebody, you know, do you know the answer to this question, right? And then if not, maybe they can connect me to someone who does know. But in order to do that, we have to have a really robust network. Which brings me to the second principle here, which is our networks that we have as public goods and cultivating those networks as public goods. So the people who I know at my institution, people who I know at other institutions, the networks that are formed because of how I'm connected with them and how they're connected with others, those can be unbelievably valuable if we are trying to solve complex problems that we can't solve as just one individual or as just one discipline. And so the very act of investing in social and intellectual networks can provide a public good in the sense that not only are we better able to get the information that we need if we have a network, but we can help connect others and provide benefits for them. And if we all invest in that, as, you know, with the recognition that, hey, we are doing a good for everyone by creating a really robust social and intellectual network, then that, I think, makes a lot more space for focusing on that, for making that a priority at the institutional level as well. And I think another thing to take into account here is that it's a very natural consequence of you know, if you have a good social and intellectual network, that information flows. You don't have to force it. You don't have to have then additional offices and mechanisms for, you know, identifying and creating networks for like a new research opportunity that might require bridging. Those things will just happen because that information is flowing within the network. And also the issue of trust and shared goals is important here as well. So if you have a network, then you have the trust, even if it's not direct, right? Well, maybe it's somebody who I know who knows somebody, but still you have those links that give you a basis for trust that you might not have if you just had, you know, somebody whose job it was in the university to identify people who they think should work together, right? So there's real value in those things coming organically from the network itself. Preserve autonomy, I could call this one, don't make zombies or don't be a zombie. So I think that if we really want to have students bring their best selves and faculty bring their best selves to the institutions that we're a part of, we have to allow space for people to bring their goals, their concerns, and their personalities and their, you know, the different kinds of, you know, interests and eccentricities and all of that to the table. And one of the ways that we can do that is by creating these sort of modular structures and allowing for partner choice. So I talked about walk away earlier, right? This strategy of, you know, you always cooperate, and then you leave if your partner isn't cooperating or if your group isn't cooperating. Allowing that autonomy to leave if something isn't working is also really important. Now, of course, you want to balance that with, you know, making sure that people, if they commit to things, that they follow through with them. But you don't want to put the cart before the commitment horse, right? You need to like have those opportunities for people to build that trust, to feel like, oh, okay, this is something that will work. This is a collaboration that will work for me. This is a class that's going to, you know, feed my needs as a student here. And so, you know, how can we do that? Well, one of the things that we could do is create flexible and modular structures. And these, because ultimately, you know, sometimes, I mean, I don't know how many collaborations you guys have had that haven't worked out, or, you know, group projects where you're like, oh, yeah, maybe I should have walked away from that one. Now, of course, it's not always as apocalyptic as this, but sometimes the best thing is to get out of the room when there's an octopus monster. So allowing for partner choice, allowing for autonomy, and that brings me to the next design principle here, which is to create opportunities for short and sweet collaborations. Things that can quickly succeed or fail. This is based on principles from commitment theory, which is sort of a sub-area of cooperation theory. And commitment theory, one of the principles is that you ratchet up from smaller, lower stakes interactions to larger scale, higher stakes interactions. You don't just start with a massive endeavor and expect everybody to be able to cooperate. You start with small things, you build trust, you build rapport, and then you move on to those larger things from that. And in my lab and my extended community, we've created our sort of little world for these short and sweet collaborations. This is zombified media that Chris was mentioning, and we've created a set of live stream shows that allow for essentially the exploration of ideas having to do with cooperation, with resilience, with, you know, how do we explore the link between humanities and science, all in the context of this being television in the zombie apocalypse. So Channel Z, television in the zombie apocalypse. I'll show you guys a little video from it at the end of my talk, which is in like 3 minutes. So this is our version of an infrastructure that allows for these short and sweet collaborations. And right now, we're actually in a phase where rather than these being just collaborations among faculty, we're having students produce some of the shows and interact with faculty to produce shows. So that's a really exciting venture. We don't know exactly how it's going to go. So far, so good. But it's fun, and it involves, you know, sort of all levels, faculty, students, staff. Cultivate interdependence. This is second to last of the design principles. And this one is actually kind of easy because already, you know, all of us care about the future in one way or another. All of us care about the future of the world. All of us care about the communities that we're embedded in, the people who we're close to. And acknowledging that and then cultivating that is one really important aspect of creating the capacity then to build those networks and to accomplish broader goals. Now, we can sort of think about there being, you know, many different kinds of interdependence. This is something that I've worked on a lot in my, you know, academic realm. But essentially, when it comes down to it, if we face challenges, if there are disasters that happen, our interests get aligned really quickly, right? And also, people stop being as concerned with competitive goals, and they're more concerned with making sure that everybody is okay. And so, if we are sort of facing the fact that we are in challenging times, then that can really facilitate facilitate feelings of interdependence that allow us to work together. And I'm going to give you my final one, and then I'll show you this little video, which is that we should leverage something called morbid curiosity. Now, what is morbid curiosity? It is that that thing that happens in the horror movie when somebody like, I'm going to open the door, and I'm going to go down to the basement because I want to know what's down there, even if it might kill me. Now, we don't necessarily want to be encouraging people to do things that are going to kill them, but we do, as educators, as people who are interested in the world, what we want to do is take that fun and that curiosity about things that are scary and dangerous and leverage that so we can have some fun thinking about the apocalypse, so that it's not just something scary that we want to avoid, so that it's something that we can be curious about, that we can play with, that we can, you know, be fascinated by, because scary play is actually a way for us to learn, too. We can learn about threats, and that can help us to build resilience. It's actually something that happens across animal societies as well. Lots of animals are actually very curious about predators and other threats, and that's an important part of them learning about them so that they can deal with them. All right, so I'm gonna end you guys out here with, this is a video compilation. Warning, there's a swear word or two in here, so close your ears if you're sensitive about that. We have a very, how do I put it? A very fun, loving group of people who have created, we've all created together this channel called Channel Z, which is television in the zombie apocalypse. This is a little sampling of some clips from some of the shows. This is something that we did when the pandemic hit. We had planned on having our zombie apocalypse medicine meeting in person. That wasn't possible, and so we decided instead we will start a YouTube channel that's Channel Z, that's television in the apocalypse. And so this is the result of that, and this is now a channel that is kind of, I'm not going to say it's fully being taken over by students, but about half being taken over by students who are creating content on it as we're moving forward now. Oh, that did not play. There we go.
The end is nigh. These are dark days. And what is the one thing that will save us from the zombie apocalypse? Science? Medicine? Disaster preparation? Or is it television? Where other platforms have fallen by the wayside, Channel Z delivers everything you need to prepare for the horrors and joys of the zombie apocalypse.
How do people feel about chainsaws?
Pandemic researchers,
Why does a rabid dog seek to bite humans or anything else it comes across?
doctors,
And so this pattern of infectious disease burden, it maps actually really well to discriminatory and segregationist practices and policies.
zombie experts,
I can just taste the healthy fats in this brain.
go bag experts,
But after the apocalypse happens, people are going to want to know this information, right?
inappropriately frisky zombies,
Hormonal contraceptives are pretty hard to come by these days.
conspiracy theories,
I gotta tell you, avocado is kind of like a green brain, is it not?
time-traveling sex researchers,
But in the future, humankind finally picked up on the fact that kids are just a huge pain in the ass, and so they decided to just stop having them altogether.
disgusting ideologies,
In order to support the war effort, Britain was exporting rice from the drought-stricken region.
swearing,
Oh, fuck.
hilarious paranoia,
I gotta be fucking quiet. I gotta be quiet.
dancers wearing hazmat suits,
Kind of learning about how the cell worked and how chaotic it was really impacted my performance.
in-depth discussions of the evolution of hip-hop,
Maybe rhyme was first and then language. Yeah.
It could have been like repetitive sound songs.
useful tools,
Getting a radio like this would be absolutely clutch.
These devices, they've got a little bit more penetration.
This is my BB gun.
questionable role models, depressed zombies,
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that I'm in this current state.
irreverent peer-reviewed rap, tasty and disgusting recipes, exercise tips, life straws, death straws, handy wipes, duct tape, undead clam cancers, interspecies empathy, reanimated corpses, tattooed fruit, classic authors, sex with dead people, imperialist propaganda, vegan zombies, economists, forensic zombie psychiatrists, universal basic income, avant-garde artists, people dating pigeons, radical inclusivity, the molecular gastronomy useful of conspiracy theories, zombie ventriloquists, a music video, fierce disagreements, feces, or armed doctors, real-life vampires, apocalypse casual fashion talk for zombies, racist sinks, sharp objects, rocks, salt, snakes, trust fund monkeys, zombie containment strategies, hopeful solutions, irreverent ethicists, a British announcer with amazing puns. This isn't your parents' opiate of the masses. Tune in now. The evolution will be televised.
All right, so that is Channel Z. It's irreverent for sure. And we kind of just try to create a space where everybody can be playful. And we have artists, we have movie producers, we have evolutionary biologists, doctors, humanities research, I mean, everybody involved in this project. So that makes it really fun. And it was also, honestly, really important for me in the aftermath of, well, I mean, not in the aftermath, in the most intense time of COVID, that I had this community of people that I was co-creating something with that was really, you know, interesting and different and creative. So yes, that was wonderful. And now can ask, where do we go from here? So I have some ideas for you guys about things that we could talk about in groups. So I'll give you a few things. You can write them down if you want. I can also get them up here after I finish talking on the slides. So one of them is, what are the challenges that you are facing now, whether you're a faculty member, a student, an administrator? What are the biggest challenges you're facing now? Because that's a good place to start in terms of the kinds of solutions that we might want to draw. And then next, what would make all of this more fun? Whether you're, again, a teacher, a professor, a student, administrator, what would make your job, your role more fun? And then, how can we work together to manage risk collectively? from the, wherever place you come from yourself, what are collective things that we could do to better manage risk in the institutions and communities that we're a part of? So we have number 1, challenges. Number 2, what would be fun? And then number 3, how can we manage risk collectively? And I hope that those first 2 can inform the third one. So, certainly when the time comes, please take enough time with those first 2 so that they can inform that third one. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for your attention and your time. And thank you to you, Chris, and everybody for having me here. It's a real delight.
All right, friends, we're going to take a little break. You can refresh your refreshments here on the coffee spot, and there's some snacks still here. If you need a restroom, that's up these stairs just outside the doors, and a hard right back into that hallway. We're at about 4:45 now. Let's be ready to talk amongst ourselves again, maybe at 5 minutes to 5. So take about 10 minutes to refresh, and we'll be back together at 4:55 for some conversation around your tables. Whatever themes sort of jumped out at you from Athena's excellent talk. Thank you, Athena. And maybe these prompts that she has offered to us. We'll see you back here at 5 minutes to 5. Thanks, everybody. Well, all right, friends, I'm going to interrupt what are no doubt some good conversations, but maybe some of the things that you've been talking about at your tables are things that the rest of us would like to hear about, and you might like to float past Athena. You might have some pressing questions for her, some ideas to share with us all. Athena, thank you again for that terrific talk. Grateful for that. Always ready to talk about the apocalypse.
And zombies, too.
And zombies.
All fair game.
So I'm a philosopher by training, and it turns out we think about zombies, too. That's kind of fun. Athena, if I may, maybe I'll jump in with a question, and then we'll turn to folks out on the floor. Just a heads up that Sarah back here is going to have a handheld microphone that she'll run to you if you want to make a comment or a question. And Grace over here has the other. So if you have a thought for us, stick your hand up in the air, and one of those two of them will run to you with a microphone. Athena, I just keep being struck by what might be the relationship between cooperation and competition. We talked a little bit earlier today about the fact that at least in the run-up to college, and no doubt in college itself, the environment feels highly competitive, I think, to prospective students. That sense of competitiveness might actually be intentionally heightened by academic institutions with the idea that they will appear more elite if they create that sense that there's a competition to get in here, there's a competition for that scholarship. Create the sense of scarcity, and you can create a sense of desire, but that might actually lead to a sense of competition. So I'm struck by the fact that competition is in significant ways woven into the culture of higher education. And your ideas about the importance of cooperation for resilience feel to me, in that sense, countercultural. What would you have to say to a college that is, in a sense, provoking competition at every turn?
Well, you're certainly right that we live in a society where competition is often foregrounded, right? I mean, a lot is based on a almost religious conviction to the idea that cooperation will ultimately lead to the best outcome for everyone. Well, turns out that that isn't always the case. Oftentimes it's not the case. Competition can do some good things. It can, you know, spur on innovation, especially friendly competition, right? Where, you know, everybody is working to maybe try to solve a problem, and they're motivated by the fact that they know other people are trying to also, right? So those kinds of things can be positive things that come out of competition. But competition can also be very wasteful and can lead to missed opportunities. So say we're all trying to solve the same problem. So I spent, I actually didn't put it up on my educational journey because I didn't really consider it part of my educational journey, but my first faculty position was a research position at UCSF. And at UCSF, it is based on competition. I had a conversation with one of the deans there when I was like, am I staying here or not? I was like, how can we get more cooperation? And he's like, well, our model is actually that, you know, it's like a flea market here. We give you a table and some power, and then you compete with everybody around you. And I was like, thanks. I think I'm going to look for a position somewhere else. But that is a dominant model in research and in academics. And I think, you know, for students, it can be a very stressful time in their lives when they're making the transition to college because of the really competitive culture. Now, where is that coming from? I mean, some of it is probably coming from colleges. Some of it might be coming from, you know, students themselves feeling competitive. Some of it might be coming from parents who want the best for their kids and maybe also want to be able to brag about them to their friends. So I think there are many, many different forces there. Competition doesn't necessarily have to crowd out cooperation, but it certainly, you know, creates an environment where extra resources are going towards, you know, trying to be better than others instead of having extra resources going towards, you know, shoring everybody else up. And so those different priorities, you know, depending on what you're trying to accomplish individually and collectively, you know, sometimes competition can be all right if it's like you really need to get to some goal and all working together isn't the best way to get there. But there are a lot of domains where cooperation is not just a more effective way of reaching the goal, but it can make everybody who is trying to reach that goal or that set of goals feel, you know, more embedded, feel more secure, feel more capable of taking risks because they know that they have a safety net of some sort if things don't go in the way that's expected.
Okay, what thoughts or questions do you all have for us? Here's one here.
Thank you so much. This is maybe a follow-on to that, but how does the prevailing academic currency of publish or perish, what's the biggest grant you've got recently, how does that play into this, and what might an alternative, more cooperative currency look like for an institution that wants to say, here's a different path to having promotion that isn't centered on that competitive dynamic?
Great set of questions. Yeah, the prevailing dominant model in academia is a very sort of individual focused, how many papers have you published, how much grant money have you brought in kind of approach. But there's room and there's already some movement, I think, happening towards changing that. So at least at ASU now, you know, doing things where you're embedded in your community, where you're doing outreach, where you're communicating with broad audiences, you know, those kinds of things which are really providing broad goods for a larger community as opposed to just sort of competing with your colleagues. Those things are starting to be now explicitly valued for promotion and tenure. With grants, you know, right now there are a lot of questions in the world that there's no way to address without an interdisciplinary approach. And so, you know, well, how do you create those spaces where, radically interdisciplinary research can happen, where radically interdisciplinary grants can get put together and can be successful. And, and that then takes not just institutional support, but a culture in those institutions where credit can be shared in a way that that acknowledges everybody's role. So, if you have an institution that sort of requires that the main PI on the grant have most of the credit, and everybody else is kind of under them, then it's actually very hard to put together any sort of collaborative team. I have another story from my sort of like early career, which is when I decided to leave UCSF, I was trying to decide whether to go to UPenn, actually back to UPenn to the med school there, or go to ASU. And in my interviews at UPenn, I learned that in their rubric for sort of, promotion and tenure, they had a category, it was called collaborator, for if you were on grants where you were a collaborator. And it turns out that was a euphemism for not being a leader. And that, to me, I was like, okay, this isn't the place for me. But there are places where, sort of being a collaborator, being someone who is, helping with things or playing any sort of supportive role, is seen and treated as like somebody, you're seen and treated as somebody who isn't the central important person. And I think that is a real blind spot, and it perpetuates a culture that doesn't really allow for people to co-create in the ways that we need to be able to in order to address the most important challenges that we're facing now, which are inherently interdisciplinary problems.
Who else? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also ties in with one of my other favorite topics, which is zombification, right? So, what happens when somebody is hijacking somebody else's effort? Then, you've gone from something that could have been cooperative to something that's exploitative. And those kinds of dynamics happen a lot in academia. It's a real risk. So I think the question then becomes, how do we preserve people's autonomy about what ventures they want to be a part of or not? And very often, like in a really good interdisciplinary project, you don't have one person who is the leader of everything. You have a sort of flexible leadership structure where when we're trying to do this kind of thing, this person is in charge. When we're trying to do this kind of thing, that person's in charge. And being able to recognize when that switch happens, to be able to have that switch happen gracefully. I think, those are the kinds of group level skills that are extremely important, but they're not things that are talked about or explicitly taught when it comes to, building interdisciplinary collaborations, or even managing something like a huge institution that might have very big picture goals that have to be addressed, as well as sort of smaller things where you have division of labor. You do sometimes need to have one person with certain expertise decide what the direction is going to be, and then have somebody else decide who knows other things. And so how do you build that trust? Because you need trust to do that, to hand over the leadership. If you have the power at the moment, how do you say, oh, my colleague actually is better suited to deal with this right now, and I trust that they will, take the reins as long as they need to, and then they will pass them to whoever needs them in order to do best for all of us. All of those things, I think, require trust, the ability to communicate effectively, the ability to coordinate, and I think those are important, collective skills for us to build.
I wondered if you could just reflect on scale and what the best scale for cooperation is, in part because it seems like so many, at least at our table, the kinds of problems being described are huge. And I think on large scales, cooperation is often more risky and vulnerable. It's easier to be taken advantage of, and the kind of trust that is required for successful collaboration often can be fostered more effectively at smaller scales. So what's the role of scale in this, and how do we kind of identify the proper scale for fruitful cooperation?
Great question, and you're absolutely right, Jeff, that it's much easier to have cooperation on a smaller scale where everybody can have relationships with each other, everyone understands a history, you can develop a rapport. It can be really easy to sort of regulate that cooperation without explicit effort or monitoring or anything like that, because it's sort of naturally just coming out of the way that we interact with people who we're close to, that we're working with. Once you start to scale up and you're on, a massive scale, whether it's a, small college or a gigantic university, I mean, those are still very large scales for our human brains and our human social networks. So how do you maintain or build cooperation at these large scales? And I'll also mention with these large scales, not only is it harder to keep cooperation, but if you over-regulate, if you over-monitor, that can make it hard to accomplish anything as a big group, right? If you have totally debilitating bureaucracy, you can't get anything done, right? So that's another challenge. So there are a couple of ways that you can deal with these kinds of issues of scaling up. One is to build the components of this larger scale in this sort of modular and cluster way, right? Where it's like, okay, you have a network of these individuals that are all pretty connected, that work together, and maybe they have a few connections out to other individuals in other modules, right? And so, every group, maybe there's, 10 or 15 people who, are in their core group. And then you have some number of those, and they're connected, with some individuals that have that, that sort of add that dimension of interconnectedness for the broader network. And if you have effective modules, then they can almost act as individuals in a sense for that next scale. Now, of course, the more you do that, the more you have like clusters that create groups that create clusters, the more opportunities there are for things to get, dysregulated, for cheaters to come in. But having that modular structure is one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do is if those groups, those entities, if the individuals within them have the autonomy to decide if they want to stay in that group, they want to leave that group, they want to invest more, they want to invest less, then that can create what's called a sort of dynamic metapopulation structure. Now I'm sort of, getting into the evolutionary biology dynamics of this, but what happens in that case is that individuals will leave the groups that are less cooperative or just less productive, right? It might even be that everyone is perfectly nice, but you're not accomplishing the things that you want to because you can't coordinate well, or maybe you didn't pick a good problem to solve or whatever. And then those individuals will go to other groups. The groups that are more productive, that are dealing with the issues, are feeling like this is really working, those groups will grow. You might need to then have those groups spin off, right? So that they don't get too big in order to be able to regulate themselves. But if you can have you know, a modular structure and a dynamic structure at the same time, then you can get cooperation at this much higher level without a lot of top-down regulation. But of course, it's a lot easier for me to program that into a computer model than it is to, you know, implement it in a complex, you know, human environment. But, you know, if we look at how hunter-gatherer societies are structured, they kind of do this automatically with like the way they have camps. People will leave, they'll join other camps. So I think we have a lot of the components of that already built into our psychology, but I think we're not in an environment that allows those to sort of manifest in a way that you know, will let us achieve that higher level cooperation, at least not yet in most institutions.
Thanks for that good question, Jeff. Who else? Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you for a great speech. So my question is about cooperation science. What does it say about industries, organizations that have very clear goals that may be counterproductive towards cooperation? And so the one I think about instinctively is business. I teach business at Pepperdine. And so with my students, we often talk about profit maximization and capitalism, right? And so with these type of organizations, the holy grail is actually what he mentioned, competitive advantage. So everything is economically motivated so we can maximize our profits. And so cooperation tends to create a zero-sum game where the more you invest into something that cooperates, the less money you make. So I'm just curious, what does cooperation science say about organizations that have kind of like a capitalistic objective structure?
Great question. I mean, part of this is that we are embedded, you know, here in the United States and in the Western world more generally, in a system where things like profit maximization are the driving force of most of the, you know, transactions and transfers that occur on the books, at least, right? So now, within the world of business, there are often times when cooperating and collaborating can lead to advantages too, right? So if you have a business where people are working together within it effectively, you're going to be able to probably make more profits than if people aren't coordinating well, if they're, you know, fighting within. So even if your goal is profit maximization, you know, cooperation can certainly enhance that in, you know, at least within the entity that's doing the competition. Because one of the most effective ways that humans compete is through cooperating within the group that is, you know, doing the competing. But I think, you know, your question, you also kind of have this like broader perspective that I think you're bringing, which is like, you know, well, what do we do with the fact that so much of our world is based on, you know, these ideas of, you know, competition and profit maximization, and, you know, I help you, or I give you something because you pay me something, and I'll help you because you'll pay me back, and that kind of being the dominant model. And one of the things that's really nice about need-based transfers is that you can implement them on a human-to-human basis without having to change anything about the big system. You can just say, hey, you know, neighbor, I want you to know, like, if we have a flood again, I'm gonna, you know, help you with getting the sandbags in front of your house. And that doesn't require changing policy, right? We can build those need-based transfer relationships where we say, I'm gonna help you if you need help without expecting anything back, while we go to our jobs where we're working for a company that's trying to maximize profits, right? So we can have those aspects of, you know, risk management be based on this human-to-human connection, need-based transfers, while still living in a society that might be dominated by, you know, competition and profit motives.
One last question, then we'll break. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Delightful. I love the 6 things at the end. I have a question about need-based transfers, and it's actually maybe even more precisely a question about the illustration of need-based transfers, which has two cups, one empty, one overflowing, in which, you know, one person's deficit is matched by another person's surplus. I wonder if it would still work if, I'm trying to think how to say this, if deficit was not always matched up with surplus, like, because that cup illustration, and maybe the cup illustration is not a full, maybe it doesn't capture the theory, but like there's no sacrifice involved there. Like even after the person empties a little of their cup, they still have enough. And I'm curious if need-based transfer still works if the cooperation involves sacrifice to such an extent that like the cooperation really costs the other person.
Great question. So to clarify, with the illustration, it does capture the main rules of need-based transfers as we have seen them manifest in these societies that we've studied, and how I've implemented them in the models too, where you only ask for help if you're in genuine need. If you are asked and able to help without going below what you need, then you help. Now, it's not a huge sacrifice if you do that, but you are giving up some of your ability to manage your own risk through risk retention, right? Because you no longer have a buffer, right? Or you have less of a buffer if you help the other. So you're sort of sacrificing one risk management strategy in order to help somebody else. Now, I think the question of, well, what happens if things get really bad, right? And if, you know, my helping you does mean going below my threshold for what I need. Well, then you get into some really interesting, almost like ethical, well, definitely ethical and philosophical questions about need-based transfers, because one thing that I didn't say yet about them is that in order for need-based transfer systems to work, everybody has to agree on what constitutes need, right? And in a time of disaster, if I'm going to, you know, go into that with the idea, well, you know, what I need now is the same as what I needed before, which is my house with my 2-car garage and my, you know, Tesla and Mercedes and all, you know, you keep your threshold up here when you're in the middle of a disaster, then you might feel very, very threatened when something bad happens. But if in the face of a disaster you say, oh, all right, I mean, I know I have all this stuff and it feels like what I need, or at least what I'm, you know, aspiring to have, but if something really bad happens in my community, then maybe I shift my threshold for need to the basics: shelter, water, fire, food, you know, or warmth food, right? And as long as I've got those, I'll help the people around me who don't have those, right? So that's one potential way of sort of shifting that threshold so that when bad things do happen, you change your priorities for, you know, what you need so that you can help support those in your community so that they can have what they need to survive and make it through and, you know, hopefully build a resilient post-apocalyptic civilization.
Thanks, Athena. I'm going to take away from today the thought of shifting my threshold of need. It does strike me that it's typical, I think, for threshold of need to climb over the course of a life. That's what it means to succeed, almost, is that my threshold of need is climbing. And to actually reverse my threshold of need, that's a tricky order, but maybe precisely what's going to be necessary in the
And it can be fun.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good.
All right, I'll give some tips for that
talk
later.
More about
yeah,
that.
We'll talk
Let's
about
thank
that.
Athena Aktipis for her contributions. Thank you. Okay, time to transition to dinner. To give some instructions for that, Grace Condello is going to come up. I'll just note that we're